what I call a political genealogy of two songs. And it just occurs to me that Margaret and I have been in this space at least twice or three times where we've given concerts about realist writers, and some of you might have heard them. And I'm always racing against the clock in talking about the songs, and the songs mostly speak for themselves. So I thought it might be an opportunity to take half an hour to say something about two of the 10 or 14 songs. And they're songs that both became popular and important in their time. But one of them, which is the Weevils in the Flower, Weevils in the Flower has been recorded more than most other Australian folk songs that I've found. Although there have been multiple recordings of traditional Australian folk songs, there are at least 30 recordings of Weevils in the Flower that I know of. One of the most recent by Robin Archer, who chose Weevils in the Flower for a very recent tour called Australian Tradition. And it's not accidental that Weevils in the Flower was first published as a song in a folk song magazine, Bruce is nodding his head, by the Victorian Folklore Society, called Australian Tradition. And it's really, as far as I know, the only folky type song that's in Robin Archer's collection. So we're going to talk not about Dorothy Hewett, but the information that I had to collect, the detailed information, comes from a chapter I was asked to write for a centenary volume about Dorothy Hewett, who would have been 100 this year had she been alive. She died in 2012. So I wrote a poem which used these two ballads to indicate what Dorothy herself thought about her poetics at the time in the realist writers. What sort of venture was she engaged upon? And also the best conclusion I've read about why she left the realist writers and the Communist Party only a few years after these songs were published, and never wrote in that genre again. She was a strong, well-known feminist poet, but she began, as a member of the Communist Party, writing realist songs in the socialist realist tradition. And I attempted to use Dorothy's own words to say what contribution that era made, in my case, to Australian folk music, and in Dorothy's case, to the act of writing poetry in Australia. So the first one, Dorothy's poem, tells the story better than it would be possible for me to do. So I'll ask Margaret to come and lead us off in the first part of the Ballad of Norman Brown as a song, not as a poem.
We're only going to do a tiny fragment because there isn't time, but this gives you an indication.
We'll do all of Weevils in the Flower. I promise I'll stop talking enough.
Rob will have to put the sign. Anyway, this is just the beginning of the Ballad of Norman Brown. There was a very simple man, honest and quiet, yet he became the mate of every working man, and every miner knows his name.
Oh, Norman Brown, oh, Norman Brown, the murdering coppers, they shot him down. They shot him down in Rothbury town. A working man called Norman Brown. An honest man, the parson said, and dropped the clods upon his head. But honest man or not, he's dead. And that's the end of Norman Brown. Cold bosses wipe their hands and sigh. It is a pity that he died. It will inflame the countryside, and all because of Norman Brown.
first little bit of
Thank you, Mark. So Norman Brown was a coal miner, a young coal miner in the village of Rothbury in the Hunter Valley. And the so-called Rothbury riot followed a 12-month lockout by those coal bosses that Dorothy mentions in the song. And as it subsequently turned out, and that is academic research and historical research that's been done, a lockout was illegal under the award operating at the time. But the lockout for 12 months caused all sorts of strife to the coal mining communities in that area. And so when the government, New South Wales government of the day, 1929, which I noted was the date on some of the postcards, the Rothbury riot took place 6 months after one of those postcards was written. In June 1929, December 1929, there was a riot. But that was an attempt by the coal miners in Rothbury for a peaceful picket line when the New South Wales government insisted to the coal miners that they reopen the mine, recruited scab labour, and the picket line began in December 1929. And one of the most graphic descriptions of the atmosphere of that picket line is provided by another song written by Graham Seal, and it happens to be one of my favourite songs. So thank you, Graham. It's called "The Country Knows the Rest," as indeed they did at the time. And so the coal bosses were implicated right from the beginning by the lockout. The parson was, as far as I can gather from research, the Anglican Archbishop of the Hunter Valley, who attended Norman Brown's funeral, which had 6,000 people, and gave a stirring talk about how a blameless man had lost his life, and that was not what happened in Australia at industrial disputes, especially if they were peaceful, and especially as most of the eyewitnesses corroborated the evidence that the miners were not armed. The whitewash of the New South Wales coronial inquiry told a different story, left an open verdict that Norman had died accidentally as an innocent bystander. Well, he was a bystander. He wasn't involved in the picket, but he'd turned up with hundreds of other miners to give support to the people who'd got to the locked gate. Of course, they broke through, went over the fence, but the police actually opened fire with pistols. Now, why? Well, the real issue I want here is not to talk about history and what we can do with that, but it's to talk about how a poem that Dorothy Hewett wrote about that incident became a folk song, the one that we've just begun to sing for you. And Dorothy wrote the poem mainly because she'd come from Western Australia as a young person where she had a very good reputation as an upcoming poet. She'd won a poetry award. A magnificent long poem called Clancy Dooley and Don McLeod, which tells a story of a strike led by Aboriginal stockmen in the Pilbara area. And that poem gave Dorothy some cachet, some entry, not only into the Communist Party, which she joined as a student at the University of Western Australia, but it also gave her an insight into the power of writing about those stories. And we've just heard a few minutes ago the power in storytelling. And that's what Dorothy wanted to do in this poem. So she eventually ended up in Sydney. I won't talk about Dorothy really, with due respect to her today. I want to just talk about those songs and what they did as artefacts, if you like, to go back to some of the things that Rob and Olya said in their paper. So Dorothy decided that what she really needed to do to contribute to the left cause and the party, the Communist Party that she joined, was to stop writing poetry. So she did. And she came to Sydney and got a job in Camperdown Spinning Mill. And her job there was to promote the party amongst the textile workers and become an organiser, which she did. And Frank Hardy, who was a bit of a hero of the left by then, because he'd published a book called Power Without Glory. It followed a very socialist realist line, but it was a captivating story. He was sued. He won the case, the legal case, against the family that sued him for talking about one of the newspaper barons in Melbourne. So Frank was pretty well known on the left. And Frank went to Dorothy and said, the best contribution you can make to the party is to write poetry, not to try to organise people on the floor in Camperdown Spinning Mill. So she, I think she says reluctantly at first, she got her battered old typewriter, as she describes it, on the kitchen table in Rosebery, where she lived, with the person she'd run away from Perth with. And he was a strong unionist, a boilermaker called Les Flood. And so Dorothy wrote the Ballad of Norman Brown from a tale she'd heard about the Rothbury Riot, most probably from somebody she was working with in the Sydney Realist Writers Group, which had been formed in 1956 by Frank Hardy himself. And that's the doorway that Dorothy used to get back into writing poetry after 5, 6, 7 years of trying, in her words, to proletarianise herself. She came from a reasonably well-to-do landed family in Perth, and she was led to believe that she needed to do this by the bosses of her local Communist Party, mostly men, all men, and she was expected to do certain functions that we've heard about today in some of the papers. And that's one of the reasons Dorothy lasted in the Communist Party for only a handful of years. But at that period, she decided to try her best, and she sent a poem to the Tribune, the Communist Party newspaper. So the Ballad of Norman Brown was published as a poem in 1957 in the Tribune, so in January 57. At the same time, though, she was insistent to herself that Norman Brown should be sung. And in the first volume of the collected works of Dorothy, which she wrote with her then husband, Merv Lilly, who was a seaman, bush carpenter and cane cutter, who'd already had songs published in the Bush Music Club magazine, she wrote in the preface to the book, "These are poems which are also songs, and they should be sung and understood as songs." So she talked then to a person that, thank you Rob and Olya, was mentioned in your paper, John Meredith, who was the founder of the Sydney Bush Music Club and the Bushwhackers Band. John was a collector along with many dozens of other collectors. And the Sing About Journal, established in 1956, was to promote and promulgate some of the music that was collected. And John Meredith was a very interesting character. I can't talk about much more today. He was also in the Communist Party. He used to meet Dorothy Hewett at Communist Party meetings and at Bush Music Club meetings. So there's a crucial connection there between individuals involved in the political scene and the literary scene. And there was a great argument raging between the actual purpose of a left-wing literary journal. Was it to encourage people, to give them a forum, to give them the confidence at a time when, with Menzies banging the Cold War drum in 1952 to 56, active periods, this is an essential context for the writing of these songs. And so Dorothy decided that John would be the person to carry this poem into a song. So he did. And he published the song in Sing About, the second edition of Sing About in 1957. So, beginning of the year, it's a 13-verse poem, Ballad of Norman Brown in the Tribune. By the end of the year, it's a song, the Ballad of Norman Brown, with half that number of verses. And all the verses that Meredith took out were recognisably in the socialist realist framework. They weren't about the story, they were about the face of the young heroic worker who'd been murdered by the brutal coppers, and what this showed is the essential nature of people getting together for collective action and bringing about a better world. And at the end of the poem, the sun is shining on the face of Norman, who is an example for everyone. Now, I'm not saying anything about the spirit of that except to endorse it, but it doesn't make a real good song to have that notion, which is essential to socialist realist art forms, in every single song. So John Meredith, member of the Communist Party himself, took those verses out, and we're left with a telling of a story which finishes with a single verse about the necessity to get together and operate as a collective. But you decide in the collective what you're going to do as a result of this thing that people knew about in the valley, that the police had opened fire on unarmed people. So that's the story of how it got published as a poem into a song. So then the song starts to be recorded and sung by people, and Dorothy thought she'd have another go. And she had a lot of goes by this stage. She's starting by 1957, 58 to be a prolific contributor to the Realist Writer, which was the literary journal of the Realist Writers Group. But Dorothy never sent her material to one outlet. She also sent poems to Overland, which is a literary political journal, and Frank Hardy had left the Overland group because his notion of a socialist realist journal was not quality poetry. It was poetry that everyone could do, and it would be a forum, an in-house journal, if you like, for a collective of people. And Overland was a more quality journal with the same kind of subject matter. I'm not using that in an evaluative sense, but you know what I mean. It's poetry that's examined and refereed and published. Well, Overland is going strong in 2025 as a progressive outlet for artwork. And the Realist Writer had 10 years of good run before it collapsed, and it's now available in the archives. Even on the Bush Music Club website, I have to give a nod to Sandra Nixon there. The Bush Music website's got an unbelievable amount of stuff on it, which you've only scratched the surface of. So the end of the story is people take up this song, the Ballad of Norman Brown. But we didn't learn it from Sing About. I've got lots of copies of Sing About in later years. We learned it from a record because Sing About folded up. It was too hard to sustain a lot of these smaller poetic journals, literary journals. So Sing About folded up. But the recorded music began to take over as sources for people like us and people like many of the people here. And so the record, Norman Brown, the first recording that I found myself was on a record published by Warren Fay, and it was called Man of the Earth. It was the first album from Larrikin Records producing collections of songs. Most of the songs, Man of the Earth, they're mining songs. Most of them were 19th century gold mining songs. 3 weren't. They were all overtly political songs written by known writers on industrial, non-rural themes, if you like. And 2 of them were about the Rothbury riot. And one of them was Dorothy Hewett's Ballad of Norman Brown. But it was set as a poem to a song by John Meredith, and he chose one of the most popular coal mining ballads from Fife, which is a fairly radical coal mining district of Scotland. And that ballad is called The Collier Laddie. And I'll follow the collier laddie, oh Norman Brown, oh Norman Brown. So it was a great choice by John Meredith to choose the collier laddie to set that song, because that had worked for 100 years in Scotland. It's one of Ewan MacColl's favourite tunes to an industrial ballad. That's what it says in the books anyway. So I think that was a really good, fortunate juxtaposition of the song and the lyrics. So we get to Dorothy having another go at Tribune. The editor was a pretty hard-nosed socialist realist interpreter, gatekeeper, if you like, called Rex Chiplin. I could talk a lot more about these people, but they're crucial in the story. And Merv Lilly told Mark Gregory, who's a very good folklorist himself, in 2003, Merv said, "I'll tell you how Island in a River," which is what he called Weevils in the Flower, a lot of people did because it's the first line, he said, Dorothy got a knockback from the Tribune, from Rex Chiplin, who said her poem wasn't political enough. And Dorothy said, "I'll give him political," and wrote a long poem called Where I Grew to Be a Man. And that poem was the story, the life story of Vera Deacon, that same young person who at this stage was helping Dorothy type the manuscript of Bobbin' Up, which became probably the first thing that Dorothy was really well known for, as a novel about the lives of women working in that Camperdown mill. And she was panned by a lot of the Communist Party hierarchy for writing that book. It's not the sort of thing you should be doing, writing about these women's lives. Bobbin' Up's published amongst other places by Virago Press. It's a classic in its own right. So Dorothy wrote Where I Grew to Be a Man, and a group of Sydney singers in the Radiation Quartet, they were Mike Layden, Mark Gregory, the folklorist later on that I mentioned. This is my ageing brain. The third member was Jeannie Lewis, who became extremely well known on the Australian scene, jazz singer, Latin. Jeannie's a fabulous singer. And the fourth person, we've got Mike Layden, Mark Gregory. Dennis Kevins was the fourth person. How could I forget Dennis Kevins, who at the time was the young secretary of the Sydney Realist Writers Group. So I will make connections between any two things I know, but there are lots of connections between all these people and the genealogy of these ballads. So inspired by Rex Chiplin, perhaps, Dorothy wrote Where I Grew to Be a Man. Mike Layden, who was the son of one of Dorothy's really close friends, a left-wing publisher called Peter Layden, who used to publish educational books and children's books, amongst other things. Mike Layden wrote what I think is an inspired tune for Where I Grew to Be a Man. Once again, he halved the length of the ballad. In fact, reduced it from 12 verses to just 4, but the poem itself has this repetitive strength. It sounds like a song, but it's hard to say that because I know it's a song, and I didn't read Where I Grew to Be a Man until I'd been singing Weevils in the Flower, and Margaret had been singing it with me. We'd been singing it for a long time before I read those words. And most of the words to Where I Grew to Be a Man that were left out of Mike Layden's songs were the socialist, realist identifiers, signifiers of a better world awaiting for us. They weren't about the story, which was growing up in the shanty towns that grew on Kooragang Island in the estuary of the Hunter River, right opposite BHP Steel. And there was a collapse in the workforce during the Depression in 1929. That's obvious and well known. But partly by reducing the wages to very low levels in the early 1930s, BHP boomed very quickly after the Depression. And that's what those kind of enterprises are set up to do. So I'm not making a judgment about that. The important thing in the ballad is the juxtaposition of the unemployed workers and their families, right opposite the mighty BHP, as it says in the song. And they were living in shanty towns. Dole bread is bitter bread, bitter bread and sour. There's grief in the taste of it. There's weevils in the flower. Now that's Dorothy's first verse, or second verse, in the poem. And Weevils in the Flower was written then in a song form by Mike Leyden, using about half of that poem and setting it to his own tune, which I've already said really fits it. And Weevils in the Flower was then sent to Australian Tradition at the end of 1965, I think, November 65. You can see it online. And it was published as Weevils in the Flower, and it became very quickly sung not only by Radiation Quartet, but all around the folk scene. And the juxtaposition of the mighty BHP with the conditions in the shanty towns on Kooragang Island was an image used by the editor of Australian Tradition at the time, Wendy Lowenstein. And Wendy has written a book of recollections from people who lived through the Depression, and it's called Weevils in the Flower. So that line in the poem has been used to signify all sorts of things about the Great Depression in Australia. And I was aware of that phrase before I knew any of this story about Dorothy and why she did it. So the song was immediately taken up by Gary Shearston, who had already recorded 3 or 4 albums of Australian traditional songs, many of which he got from Sing About. He'd also recorded 2 of Dorothy's songs, peace songs, which he found in her collection, her first collection of poems from this realist writer's period. But in 1965, that year again, he published Australian Broadside, and that was all politically based songs. All of them were from Australia, even though they were given that sort of title, protest song, because we were importing that idea from America. They were political songs rather than protest songs. But they were all Australian. And that record was absolutely gobsmacking to me as a teenager in Canberra, when I was just starting to try and become a solo folk singer and singing with little groups. And we started to listen to Gary Shearston's album. I subsequently found out that Gary's album, Australian Broadside, was, for 1 week towards the end of 1965, it was 6th in the bestsellers of the week. That's a folk music album. It was 6th in the national survey of selling albums, and he had a top 40 hit with a song called Sydney Town, which was written by Frank Hardy, but Frank didn't like the way Gary Shearston set it to a Bob Dylan tune when he recorded it. So Frank sort of did harumph, but he was secretly, and not so secretly, very happy to get into the top 10.
If we're going to do the song, you're going to have to stop very, very soon because
Okay.
it's 4:15.
So now we will
It's got
sing.
another 2 or 3 hours on this.
So thank you, Mark. Now we get to the climax of the paper, in as much as Weevils in the Flower, written to this tune by Mike Leyden, was recorded by Gary Shearston, by Jeannie Lewis, by a lot of people. And I'd love Margaret to come up and sing it now.
Well, you all know it.
Yeah, we all know it. And then I'll just make 4 very quick reflections. I'm going okay. It's just.
No, 4:15, we're supposed to be finishing.
Well, let's
It's
go.
4:15.
I know, but sing it. Let's sing it. Go. Okay.
You don't have to. I'm sure you've seen us on stage with me saying,
I thought it would be easier if I.
you forgot to say about the murdering bosses and the murdering coppers. That's
Oh no, that's only a. You
Get that one.
You can read that in the book. Okay, so here's Weevils in the Flower, as tuned by Mike Leyden, words by Dorothy Hewett. Whoops.
On an island in a river, how that bitter river ran. I grew on scraps of charity the best way that you can. On an island in a river where I grew to be a man. For tall bread is bitter bread, bitter bread and sour. There's grief in the taste of it, there's weevils in the flour, there's weevils in the flour. And just across the river stood the mighty BHP, poured pollution on the water, poured the lead of misery, and its smoke was black as Hades, rolling hungry to the sea. For tall bread is bitter bread, bitter bread and sour. There's grief in the taste of it, there's weevils in the flour, there's weevils in the flour. In those humpies by the river, we lived on dough and stew, while just across the river those greedy smokestacks grew, and the hunger of the many fed the bellies of a few. For tall bread is bitter bread, bitter bread and sour. There's grief in the taste of it, there's weevils in the flour, there's weevils in the flour. On an island in a river, how that bitter river ran. It broke the banks of charity, and it baked the bread of man. On an island in a river where I grew to be a man. For tall bread is bitter bread, there's weevils in the flour, but a man grows strong as iron on black bread and sour, on black bread and sour.
Vera Deacon's dad was the man.
Ah, right. Thank you. Bob and Margaret, thank you very much for ending the conference on a wonderful high note. Joined in by all of us.
Thank you
It
for
went really
asking.
well. Thank you very much. And a very appropriate ending too, I think, for the themes that have come out in the day's speakers and what they've said. So thank you all very much for coming. Thank you for the festival for having us, and thank you very much to the presenters, of course. Thank you to Rob and Ollie and Maureen, and also Bruce for helping out with the AV. There is tech moments. And as I said, thank you to all of you, and I hope you have a very good festival. Thank you.